I never imagined that my father's passing would set off a chain of events that felt straight out of a legal drama. Dad had always been the strong, silent type, the kind of man who worked hard, loved harder, and always provided. He wasn't flashy, but he left behind more than memories. He left behind a legacy. A beautiful old house we all grew up in, some carefully managed investments, and a collection of vintage cars that made my heart skip a beat every time I stepped into the garage. Each one was a piece of history, and knowing Dad, he'd kept them not just for their value, but because they reminded him of simpler times. I'm Giselle, the youngest in the family. I've always been the one who tried to keep the peace, the glue that held things together when life got messy. But what happened after Dad's funeral? Nothing could have prepared me for that. And it all started with my older brother, Mark. Now, Mark has always been a bit different. If you've got siblings, you'll understand what I mean. He was the one who played by his own rules. The black sheep, the storm in every family dinner. He lived a fast-paced life, made bold decisions, and often left behind chaos for others to clean up. So, I guess I shouldn't have been surprised when, at Dad's funeral, Mark started talking more about assets than memories. He didn't even wait for the flowers to wilt before diving into financial talk. "I've got kids to raise," he said, swirling a glass of wine like he was negotiating at a board meeting. "And bills to pay. I mean, let's be real, I should get the lion's share." Classic Mark, always angling for an edge, always spinning a story to suit his narrative. At first, I brushed it off. I was too deep in grief, too overwhelmed by the loss of the man who had been my anchor. But then I started noticing things. Quiet conversations between Mark and Mr. Stevens, Dad's longtime lawyer, whispers in corners during family gatherings, little looks and closed doors. It all seemed off. Still, I had no proof, no solid reason to confront him. So I waited, and the truth, as it always does, revealed itself at the reading of the will. The whole family gathered in Mr. Stevens' wood-paneled office. The room smelled of old books and coffee, and the tension was so thick you could practically chew on it. I sat next to my sister, heart pounding, trying not to imagine what Dad might have written. We were all on edge, but Mark? Mark looked smug, like he already knew how the story ended. Mr. Stevens cleared his throat and began to read. Sure enough, as expected, Mark was named the primary beneficiary. He was to receive the family home, a majority of the investments, and, of course, the vintage cars. My stomach dropped. I could feel the blood rush from my face as I tried to process it all. But then Mr. Stevens paused. He looked up from the paper, peering at us over his glasses with an expression I'll never forget. "There's a condition," he said. The room froze. Even Mark sat up a little straighter. "In order for Mark to receive his share of the estate," Mr. Stevens continued, "he must live in the family home for 1 full year. He may not sell it. He may not rent it out. If he fails to meet this condition, the entirety of the estate will be divided equally among the remaining family members." Silence, absolute silence, and then chaos. Mark's face turned a shade of red I didn't know human skin could reach. He exploded. "You can't be serious," he barked, standing up so fast his chair toppled over. "This is ridiculous. This isn't what Dad would have wanted." Mr. Stevens remained calm. "These are your father's wishes, Mark. He outlined them clearly and legally. I'm simply the executor." My sister stifled a giggle. I couldn't help but smirk. The irony was too rich. Mark, who had schemed and angled for his payday, now had to earn it. And not through work, but by living in a house filled with memories he'd tried to run from for years. He stormed out, vowing to fight it in court, said he'd contest the will, said he'd prove Dad was manipulated. But we all knew the truth. Dad had always been careful, thorough. He wouldn't have left room for loopholes. The following weeks were interesting, to say the least. Mark tried everything. He called in favors. He sent long emails to Mr. Stevens. He even tried to sweet-talk us into backing him up. "Come on, Giselle," he said to me one day, with a forced grin. "You don't really want to split this place, do you? It'll just get messy. Let me handle it." I just looked at him and said, "Then move in." And move in he did. Reluctantly, angrily, Mark packed up his penthouse life and relocated to the family home. From the moment he stepped inside, it was clear he didn't belong there. The silence, the creaking floors, the scent of old wood and time-worn memories, it all seemed to swallow him whole. We helped him move in, of course. We weren't cruel. We wanted to honor Dad's wish, but we made sure every condition was crystal clear. No renters, no realtors, no shortcuts. And here's where it gets interesting because our old neighborhood, let's just say it came alive in the most unexpected way. The neighbors who had known our family for decades became watchdogs. They'd see a car in the driveway and call us. They heard a rumor Mark was listing the place, and they'd report back immediately. It was like the whole block had joined Dad's mission. Mark tried to play it cool, but it was obvious. He was unraveling. He had spent his adult life in luxury, where every whim was catered to. Suddenly, he had to take out his own trash, fix his own plumbing, and, God forbid, cook his own meals. One night, I got a call from our old neighbor, Mrs. Nolan. "You might want to check on your brother," she said, barely containing her laughter. "He set off the fire alarm, tried to make lasagna, I think." I stopped by the next morning and found Mark covered in soot standing in the yard like a war veteran returning from the battlefield. "This house hates me," he muttered. I smiled. "No, Mark, it's just holding you accountable." It didn't take long before Mark's discomfort turned into full-blown resentment. Every time I visited, he looked more tired, more fed up, like he was counting the seconds until the year was up. And honestly, I could see why. The house was no longer just a childhood memory. It was turning into his personal prison. And here's the thing, our dad knew exactly what he was doing. This wasn't about punishing Mark. It was about teaching him something he had never been forced to learn: humility, responsibility, and maybe even a little gratitude. But Mark, he wasn't catching on, not yet. Instead, he spent most of his time pacing around like a lion in a cage. Every creak in the floor seemed to get under his skin. Every squeaky door hinge was a personal insult. The kitchen? A war zone. I walked in one afternoon to find a burned pan in the sink, half a loaf of bread on the floor, and the toaster smoking. "I don't know how people live like this," he groaned. "Like what?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Normal, with like chores and shopping lists and ovens that hate you." I couldn't help but laugh. "Welcome to adulthood, big brother." But the real fun started when the neighborhood got involved. Again. You see, our neighbors weren't just curious observers. They were committed, fiercely loyal to our dad and his wishes. And they weren't about to let Mark sneak around the rules. Not on their watch. Word traveled fast on our street. Faster than social media, honestly. If Mark so much as Googled "sell inherited property," someone would somehow find out. He made one phone call to a real estate agent, just to ask a few questions, or so he claimed, and 3 neighbors called me within the hour. It was hilarious. Even more entertaining was when Mark tried to rent out a spare bedroom, thinking it might help cover his expenses. He posted a discreet ad online, trying to keep it low-key. But one of our neighbors, Mr. Patel, saw it and decided to have a little fun. He posed as a potential tenant, showed up for a tour, and asked Mark every question under the sun. He kept him going for nearly an hour before casually saying, "So, did your dad mention in his will that this would be a violation of the terms?" Mark's jaw dropped. He slammed the door in poor Mr. Patel's face. But word spread like wildfire, and from then on, Mark couldn't make a single move without someone watching. The walls were closing in on him, and it showed. He started skipping meals, barely slept, and spent his days muttering to himself. I think he truly believed the house was haunted, or cursed. One night, I stopped by to drop off a few groceries, and I found him sitting in the living room, staring at the fireplace like it might burst into flames. "Something's not right," he whispered. "The lights flicker for no reason. Doors open and close by themselves. And yesterday I swear I heard footsteps upstairs when no one else was home." I sat beside him and smiled gently. "Maybe it's just the house reminding you to respect it." He didn't laugh. He didn't even blink. Mark had once been the type to brush off things like tradition, sentiment, and family. But now, the house was getting to him. It was stripping away all that bravado, all that ego. And in its place, well, something else was starting to emerge. Not empathy, not yet, but a crack in the armor. A space where change might slip in. The months dragged on, and every visit revealed a new chapter in the Mark versus the house saga. I started keeping a little journal of his most ridiculous moments, like the time he mistook the attic fan for a raccoon and called pest control, or the day the water heater broke and he tried to fix it himself, resulting in a minor flood and one very soggy, very angry Mark. But even in the chaos, there were moments of quiet, moments that made me wonder if maybe, just maybe, he was starting to get it. Once I walked in and saw him holding one of Dad's old jackets. It was a corduroy coat that Dad wore every winter, even when it had gone out of style. Mark didn't notice me at first. He just stood there, running his fingers over the fabric like it was made of gold. "He wore this when he taught me how to ride a bike," Mark said softly, almost to himself. I didn't say a word. I just watched as he folded the jacket and placed it carefully back into the closet. That was the first time I saw something real, something raw. Maybe this house wasn't just a trap. Maybe it was a mirror, forcing Mark to see himself the way we had always seen him. Flawed, human, and maybe a little lost. By month 8, the neighborhood had completely turned on him. Not out of malice, but because they were exhausted. He stopped waving when people passed by. He didn't return borrowed tools. He even forgot Mrs. Nolan's birthday, which was basically social suicide on our block. Still, no one gave up. Not on him, not on the house, and definitely not on Dad's wishes. And through it all, I stayed close. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to believe that somewhere under the bitterness and the pride, my brother was still in there. That maybe, by the time the year was up, he'd be ready to let go of the old Mark and step into someone new. Was it foolish? Maybe. But hope is a funny thing. It grows in the smallest cracks, and it can survive almost anything, even the kind of stubbornness that runs in our family. And then, just when I thought the worst had passed, the house decided to speak louder. You'd think after 8 or 9 months, Mark would have settled into some kind of routine, maybe even found a bit of peace in that old house. But instead, things started to get weird. And I'm not just talking about him forgetting how to use a dishwasher or losing arguments with the thermostat. No, I'm talking weird. It started with the roof, a small leak in the guest bedroom, nothing major. Mark called a contractor, paid them a ridiculous amount of money, and thought that was the end of it. 2 weeks later, the leak was back, this time in the hallway, then in the laundry room, like the house was playing whack-a-mole with him. No matter how much he spent, the roof just wouldn't cooperate. Next it was the furnace. It would groan, then roar, then go dead silent for days. The temperature would swing from sauna to igloo and back again, and no technician could explain it. One guy even said, "It's like the system's got a mind of its own." Mark just blinked. "Yeah, that checks out." The strangest part, though, was the creaking floors. Now, we grew up in that house. We knew the sounds it made. But these creaks were different, rhythmic, purposeful, like footsteps, and always at night. I didn't want to believe it either. I'm not the type to jump to ghost stories. But one evening Mark called me, his voice low and shaky. "Giselle," he said, "I need you to come over." When I arrived, he looked pale, not just tired, but spooked. He pointed to the upstairs hallway and whispered, "I heard someone walking, and I was the only one here." I listened. Silence. But I believed him. Not because I thought the house was haunted, but because I knew that house was alive in its own way. It had seen generations of our family laugh, cry, fight, forgive. It had personality, memory, maybe even a little magic. Or maybe it just didn't like being disrespected. Mark had treated the place like a means to an end. A golden ticket. But to the rest of us, it was more than wood and walls. It was home. After that night, things escalated. Light bulbs flickered constantly, even when brand new. Doors slammed shut in empty rooms. The power would cut out randomly, and no electrician could figure out why. One even said, "It's almost like the wiring's responding to mood." Mark was unraveling. You could see it in the way he moved, jumpy, irritable, always looking over his shoulder. He started sleeping downstairs with the lights on. He wouldn't go near the attic. And the garage? Off limits, even with all of Dad's beautiful cars still parked in there. The house was wearing him down. Every time he tried to assert control, it pushed back. And deep down, I think he finally understood. This wasn't his kingdom. This was Dad's legacy. And legacies aren't meant to be exploited. They're meant to be honored. But Mark wasn't ready to surrender. Not yet. He held on with every ounce of stubbornness he had left. And then came the storm. It was one of those wild spring nights where the sky turns green and the air hums with electricity. Thunder cracked so loud it rattled the windows. Rain came down in sheets. And in the middle of it all, the house changed. I got the call at 2:17 a.m. "Giselle," Mark said, his voice hoarse and frantic. "You need to come now. I think something's wrong with the house." When I arrived, the front door was wide open, swinging in the wind. Mark stood barefoot on the porch, soaked to the bone, shaking like a leaf. Inside, It was chaos. Furniture had been tossed, not like from wind, but like it had moved itself. The chandelier in the hallway was swaying, even though there was no breeze inside. And the fireplace, it was lit. No one had touched it in months. "What happened?" I asked. He looked at me, eyes wild. "I don't know. It started with a bang upstairs, then the lights went out, and then things started flying. I swear the armchair lifted off the ground. I should have laughed. I should have said, 'You've lost it.' But I didn't, because something in the air felt different. Charged. Sacred. The house had had enough. Mark didn't sleep that night. Neither did I. We sat in the living room in silence, listening to the rain pound the roof and the occasional shudder of the walls. It felt like the house was breathing, watching. By morning, Mark was done. You could see it in his face. The fight had drained out of him. "I'm not staying here another night," he said. "I don't care about the inheritance. I don't care about the house. I want to go." And just like that, it was over. He packed his things, what little he hadn't already ruined or abandoned, and left the house without looking back. He didn't say goodbye. He didn't slam the door. He just disappeared into the misty morning, leaving behind the life he thought he deserved. And the house? It went still, peaceful, like it had exhaled. Dad's will had done exactly what it was meant to do. It revealed character, it tested heart, and in the end, it protected what mattered most. The rest of us gathered a few days later. We cleaned up the mess, we fixed what needed fixing, and when we walked through those old rooms, something felt different, lighter, warmer. But just when we thought the story had reached its final chapter, we found something that changed everything we thought we knew. The house was quiet now. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, every creak and groan came from age, not anger. Mark was gone, and the storm had passed. The air inside the family home had shifted, no longer tense or combative. It felt calm, like the house itself had finally relaxed. After Mark left, I stayed behind for a few days to help clear out the last of his things. Not because I had to, but because the house deserved better than to sit alone, boxed in by dust and echoes. On the third day, I wandered into the study. Dad's study. A room Mark had barely touched. The desk was still there, carved with little notches from decades of paper clips, pencils, and life. I ran my hand along the worn wood and opened the drawer I had opened 1,000 times as a kid. Nothing new, until I spotted something I hadn't noticed before. Tucked beneath a pile of yellowed receipts was an old leather-bound journal. Worn and faded, the corners curled. It looked like it hadn't seen daylight in years. Curious, I sat down and opened it. The handwriting stopped me cold. It was Dad's. Clean, confident strokes of ink that hadn't changed in all the letters and birthday cards he'd written us over the years. But these entries weren't short notes. They were thoughts. Observations. A man's inner world poured across the pages. At first it was the usual, memories of us as kids, thoughts about Mom, little reflections on life. But the deeper I read, the more I realized this wasn't just a diary, it was a plan, a roadmap of everything he had orchestrated in those final months of his life. He had known. He knew Mark would try to take more than his fair share. He knew how the neighborhood would react. He even suspected the house itself would resist change. One entry read, "Mark always ran from responsibility. If I give him an easy way out, he'll take it. But if I ask him to stay, to live inside this home, not just inherit it, maybe he'll understand what it means to carry a legacy." Another said, "This house has a spirit. It remembers. It loves. It protects. I don't want it sold off to the highest bidder. I want it cherished." I kept flipping pages, stunned by the level of detail. Dad had accounted for nearly everything. He trusted Mr. Stevens, the neighbors, and even the house itself to uphold his wishes. It wasn't just an inheritance, it was a test. And in the final entry, scribbled in slightly shakier handwriting, he wrote, "If they find this journal, I hope they understand I wasn't trying to punish anyone. I just wanted them to feel what I felt for this place. If they do, then the house will live on, not just in brick and beams, but in heart." I closed the journal and sat in silence. The weight of his words hit me like a wave. All this time we thought Dad had left behind an eccentric will to stir the pot. But he hadn't. He had built a masterpiece, a living, breathing lesson wrapped in nostalgia, memory, and mystery. Later that week, we gathered the rest of the family. We told them about the journal, and I read aloud some of the entries over coffee in the kitchen. No one said a word for a while. Even my sister, who always had a comment ready, just sat there blinking back tears. "I guess he knew us better than we thought," she finally whispered. We all nodded. And it was in that moment that something shifted, not just in the house, but in us. We weren't just siblings squabbling over who got what. We were stewards now, guardians of something greater than ourselves. So we made a decision. We wouldn't sell the house. We wouldn't split it into timeshares or put it on Airbnb. We'd keep it together. We'd turn it into a family gathering place. Holidays, reunions, lazy summer weekends. A space where the next generation could run barefoot through the halls just like we did. Where laughter would bounce off the walls and memories would take root like ivy. We fixed what needed fixing. We painted the front porch. We even restored the old swing Dad built in the backyard. The one that creaked like it had secrets to tell. The neighborhood welcomed the change like an old friend returning from a long trip. And as for the vintage cars, we polished them, tuned them up, and decided to keep them too. Not because they were valuable, but because they were part of the story, part of him. Occasionally, I'd visit alone. I'd sit in the study with the journal and reread those entries, sometimes smiling, sometimes crying. I could hear Dad's voice in every line, stern, wise, and just a little mischievous. He had done what so many parents dream of. He passed on more than wealth. He passed on wisdom, and he made sure we earned it. Mark, surprisingly, reached out a few months later. He sent me a short message. No grand apology, no excuses. Just, "I get it now, I really do. Thanks for holding the line." I didn't reply. Not because I was angry, but because I didn't need to. Some lessons are better absorbed in silence. I figured one day he'd come back and walk through the front door again, maybe with his kids, maybe just to sit under the big oak tree out front and remember. And if he does, we'll welcome him, because despite everything, he's still one of us. And this house, it still belongs to all of us, warts and all. Now, when I stand in the doorway of our family home, I don't just see walls and windows. I see a story that's still being written. I see echoes of the past and possibilities for the future. I see love, deep, complicated, stubborn love. Dad knew that, and he gave us the most unexpected gift by making sure we knew it too. So here's to him, to the house, to the storm and the silence, to the drama and the healing, and to you for taking this journey with me. Because sometimes the most meaningful stories aren't found in books or movies. Sometimes they live right under our noses, in the creaky old houses we grew up in the messy, beautiful families we're born into, in the quiet plans of fathers who just wanted to be understood. And now finally I do.